Hello again, friends, awesome summer school students and plaid peoples everywhere. Many of you who have been asking me to do a Plaidcaster 10 on the current devolution and debacle in the state of Iraq. And I typically don't do current events that are so hot that we can't even predict what's going to happen an hour from now, much less tomorrow or next week. But this situation is so serious and so big in its repercussions that are going to reverberate across the region and the world, no matter what happens, that I think it is worthy to dabble with it a bit. In fact, let's do a couple of podcasts on this one. The first one will be about some names and spaces and historic places and peoples that are behind why the state is unraveling. And then maybe the next podcast will be on the repercussions themselves and what can we speculate about the role of Iran or the United States or Russia or Syria in all of this. Let's entitle this two-parter, maybe three, Iraq is a wreck. Because it is done, my friends. I say this with zero amount of pleasure nor pride in predicting this, because for those of you that have taken my classes or read any of my stuff in the last decade, you know that for a decade I've been predicting Iraq to fall into civil war. I'm actually surprised it took this long. Ever since the 2003 invasion by the United States, a lot of us pessimistic pundits have been saying this is an unsustainable situation. It's an unsustainable state. Why? Well, there's three different distinct groups in Iraq. There are Arab Sunnis, Sunni being the major sect of Islam. There are Arab Shias, the other sect of Islam. And there are Kurds, ethnically Kurd people who aren't ethnically Arab. And these three groups have not gotten along well together ever. For their part, the Kurds have been wanting a separate state for centuries and have never wanted to be part of Iraq. And because of domestic politics in this place in just the last 10 years since the United States invaded, I guess 11 years now, the writing has been on the wall that these groups of people are going to tear this country apart, and that's what you're seeing. So I try not to make radical predictions, but this one's not even that tough of a call. I don't know what it's going to look like 5 years from now, but it's not going to be that. This is the beginning of the end game for Iraq. And it's a shame because it's going to be a lot of pain and suffering in a country full of millions of people who've already suffered plenty in the last 10 years, and there's more coming. But the state will go away. And who's to blame for this? What's going on? Well, the news story, the sound bites that you're getting, and I'll try to keep it this ultra brief and then come back to it to explain it in more detail. The news we're getting right now is that this crazy radical Islamic extremist nutbag group called ISIS, or ISIL, ISIS or ISIL, is currently, they have been fighting, and a radical extremist or Islamic group who want to form an Islamic state in this area. And they've been fighting in the Syrian civil war to overthrow the government of Syria. And they now control areas of eastern Syria and now western Iraq. And the big news of the last 72 hours is they are on an offensive. They are a military of 10 to 15,000 people who are on an offensive. They've taken the second biggest city in Iraq called Mosul. They control it. They control this whole western side of Iraq now. And they're storming, they're marching towards Baghdad, the capital of the sovereign state of Iraq. And the Iraqi army, for its part, is folding under the wake of these 10 to 15,000 militants. And the Iraqi government may be on the brink of collapse. And they're asking for anyone from the outside, mostly the United States, to come help them. And the U.S. doesn't want to help them, and we're not sure who's going to help. That's what you're hearing on the news. Okay, well, let's unpack this a bit. For those of you that are first-time watchers of this Plaid podcast stuff, I am not an expert on this. I am not speaking from any definitive academic ivory tower standard. What I try to do is pick apart different things and introduce some themes and some topics and some names that you hear about on the news and give it to you in a little bit more detail so that you understand the situation better. No, by the way, nobody can predict what's going to happen within the next 24 hours. This is so volatile. So I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to try to explain a little bit about who's fighting here and who these people are and how this came about. Ready? Okay. So that's what's happening. A radical band of Islamic militants are storming across Iraq, threatening to take over the entire state, and it looks like they're winning right now. That's the scary part. Who's to blame for this? Was this a surprise that these people come out of nowhere? What? Who is this? They just showed up and now they're taking over the state. No, if you follow current events and follow history at all, this is no surprise whatsoever. Which is why I say most of us who are pessimistic have said, this is going to happen. Of course it's going to happen. Of course the state's going to collapse. By the way, a side note, my prediction was that the Kurds were going to declare independence that would start the ball rolling towards complete civil war and chaos. So I was wrong on that, but watch out because the Kurds are going to do it in the next month. So who is to blame for this mess? Because it's not a surprise. Well, let me give you the U.S. news interpretation. Let me give you the U.S. domestic consumption BS that you're going to hear on all networks, 100% of them. Here we go. I can probably do this in 60 seconds or less. In the United States, who's to blame for Iraq falling into chaos? All of the Democrats, anybody who's left liberal-minded or Democratic Party people will say this is 100% the Bush administration's fault. The Bush administration started this war in 2003. It was an ill-planned, ill-fated war. It was destined for failure from the start. It was based on flimsy, faulty, falsified evidence that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and or was a terrorist who was going to terrorize the world. That has now been roundly disproven. I'm not trying to offend anybody, but pretty much disproven. That was the second Iraq war, by the way. The first Iraq war was 94 when we invaded to help liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein. But the second Iraq war was not very popular with, I'd say, nobody on planet Earth. Not very popular with hardly anyone on planet Earth outside of the United States. In the United States, it was supported by over half the people and obviously the Congress. But that support diminished over the last decade as this has gone kind of nowhere. And the United States went in there with the idea to liberate Iraq from Saddam Hussein, a dictator, and he was a bad guy, and establish a democracy. That sounds good, but it just was not going to ever work out for reasons we'll get into in more detail. So the Democrats in the United States will say it's all the Bush administration's fault for overthrowing Saddam Hussein and getting involved in this war, which was destined for failure. The conservative, the center-right Republican pundits in the United States will say this is all Barack Obama's fault. You see how this works? And they will say the Bush war was a decent war, overthrew Saddam Hussein, and it was because of the way that the Barack Obama administration left Iraq. They pulled other troops out. They didn't leave any support structure. They didn't even leave any air support to support the government so that the democracy could flourish. And it's all their fault for pulling out too early and leaving in a mess that was destined for chaos. That's it. Hopefully I've now offended everyone in the United States so you can at least know that I'm being objective. This side of the aisle will say it's all Bush's fault. That side of the aisle will say it's all Barack Obama's fault. Who's right? All of them are. This was a fairly ill-conceived, ill-planned war. Trying to establish a democracy here in a handful of years was not just problematic, it was laughable. And to give the Republicans some due, the way the U.S. left was perhaps even worse. So you have a bad war that you started and a bad war that you walked away from. Coming and going, the U.S. has done pretty much nothing right here. And everybody's to blame. But let's get away from the United States. The world's also going to blame the United States. In fact, as a side note, the Russians have already made several public statements saying this whole mess in Iraq is all because of American adventurism. American and British, because the British are the lapdogs of the United States. So this is American and British adventurism. Them dabbling and messing in other foreign countries in sovereign states. This is what you get when you mess around in states that ain't yours. The Russians have a point with that, and they're getting a lot of press, and a lot of countries are saying, yep. The Chinese are saying, yep, that's why we don't do it. So you have that angle from the world. You have that angle internally. However, everybody, Republican, Democratic, and the world opinion, also, if you're versed in these subjects, blames this dude named Nouri al-Malaki. He's the current prime minister of Iraq. And he has been prime minister pretty much for the last 5 to 10 years, I guess. And he has not really facilitated this democracy flourishing, not like a democracy is supposed to flourish. Because Saddam Hussein was a dictator. Wasn't a democracy. He was a dictator. And he ruled the country with an iron fist and said, it's going to be my way. And then the U.S. came and overthrew him, and we turned it into a democracy, and so everybody should get a vote then. But unfortunately, the Prime Minister, Nouri al-Malaki, pretty much just said, well, I'm not a dictator, I was voted in, but I'm pretty much just going to run it my way. Now, let me unpack that a little bit, because maybe some of you know nothing about Iraq and nothing about the U.S. intervention there. And I wanted to keep this brief, but it's already getting long. But bear with me if you want to understand why the place is falling apart. Saddam Hussein, bad guy, that Saddam, bad. He was a Sunni Arab. Remember the three different groups I told you about already? Sunni Arab, Shia Arab, and Kurds. Saddam was a Sunni Arab, and he was all about Sunni power, all about Arab power. Okay, he was all pro-Arab. His political party, the Ba'athist Party, B-A-A-T-H, the Ba'athist. There's Ba'athist parties in Iraq and Syria. Let's not forget Syria is right over there, and they're part of this. The Ba'athist Party is a pro-Arab, pro-Sunni, woo, greater Sunni power. Let's build a huge conglomerate Arab state. That, I think still that's kind of the Ba'athist Party politics, the political line. So that was Saddam Hussein, Sunni Arab. Sunnis are a minority in Iraq. The majority group is actually the Shia Arabs. Shia, that other sect of Islam. And during Saddam Hussein's rule as a dictator for decades, even though he's a minority, he stocked the entire government of Iraq with Ba'athist Party Sunni folks. The entire military was Sunni Ba'athist Party folks. The entire superstructure of the state was Sunni, because that's what Saddam Hussein was. Sunni power, Arab power. Got it so far? He ruled over a majority Shia. And he crushed the Kurds down too. So he crushed down the Shias with an iron fist, crushed down the Kurds up north with an iron fist as well. Enter the United States, overthrow Saddam. He's bad, bad guy. He goes away. Democracy, we love democracy. Who gets to rule in a democracy? Oh yeah, the majority rules in a democracy. Who's the majority? Shia Arabs are the majority in Iraq. So once the United States established a democracy there, the Shias came into power. And thus, Nouri al-Malaki, a Shia guy, has been the prime minister of this country for the last 5 to 8 years. The United States and other outside entities were hopeful that he was going to say, that Malaki would say, oh, well, we're a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state, and we got Kurds up here and Sunnis, and we want to be inclusive. We want everybody. We don't want to run the place like Saddam did. We want to be inclusive so everybody has a voice in the government. And he pretty much did the opposite. And now I can start to summarize a little quicker. How did he do the opposite? He, even though it was supposed to be power sharing in a democracy, he pretty much alienated sheiks and tribesmen who were of Sunni religion. And these were folks who helped dispel and kick out al-Qaeda elements earlier. And under the promise that that the Sunnis were going to get a fair shake in the government, they helped the government hold together for the first 5 years. And then Malaki kind of dissed them. It's like, well, oh, psych, now we really not going to share any power with you guys. He purged out all Sunni leadership out of the bureaucracy itself. He started firing Ba'athist Sunni ministers and government people who had decades of experience in the government, fired all them, and sometimes put them in prison and sometimes chased them out of the country. He purged all Sunni influence out of the military. So what you have is he essentially, in a sense, and this is going to be a little offensive to some, and I understand, in a sense he just replaced Saddam Hussein. He was elected prime minister. His political party won the day in Iraq, so he got to be the prime minister. And instead of being inclusive and bringing all parties together, he pretty much just said, well, Saddam used to look out after the Sunnis. Now it's my team's turn. I'm going to look out after the Shias. So Iran is a kind of a Shia state. Side note that hopefully you know already. The majority of Shias on planet Earth live next door in Iran. So the Iraqi government has been befriending and cozying up more with Iran all this time, as opposed to trying to unify and build a sense of national spirit in the country. And now we can play it forward into, okay, so what happened to cause all this? Suddenly, this surprise ISIS group just popped up? Nope, it's no surprise. Because of the chaos and the destabilization due to the Iraq War itself, started in 2003, and then Malaki's mismanagement of the government and building it into a Shia powerhouse in the ensuing years, the Sunnis have gotten pissed off. And I'm not defending anybody, but, you know, all of those folks who used to be in power, the Sunnis, many of them used to be government bureaucrats and run the military. They're ejected from power, and they increasingly were like, we're just going to continue to get picked on and persecuted, and why the hell would we pretend to even be part of this government? We're getting rejected. So some of them, not all of them, but many became radicalized. And by the way, many Sunnis never stopped fighting to begin with. Ever since the U.S. invasion in 2003, many elements of the military just laid down their arms and said, fine, okay, the U.S., you're in charge, whatever. And, oh, the U.S. is leaving. Okay, pick our arms back up again. Many of these folks joined radical groups and terrorist groups right from the get-go to cause destabilization in Iraq. They didn't want to lose their power. They felt like that the Shia, if you build a democracy, the Shias will dominate it, and then they'll start picking on us Sunnis because Sunni Saddam Hussein crushed them for decades. And now they're looking at today's Iraq saying, and we were right, and we told you so, and it's a Shia state, and they're picking on us Sunnis. So those that were radicalized early feel vindicated, and they're fighting even harder. And whenever you've heard about terrorist attacks and suicide bombings happening in Iraq in the last decade, it's that Sunni fringe who were pissed off from the get-go, and their ranks have been swelling for the last 5 years. Starting to see it now? Okay. Who's ISIS then? This ISIS... Oh, one more thing, one more side note before we get to ISIS. The Kurds, who control the whole northeastern quadrant up there, they've never wanted to be part of Iraq. They're ethnically not Arab. They're Sunni Islamic, but that's of no consequence. They're a different ethnicity. The Kurds are spread throughout all these countries. Let me flash up a map of Kurdistan. For those in the know, you know many Kurds have wanted a separate state of Kurdistan for centuries, and it appears they're going to get it. They already have their own government up in northeastern Iraq. They've got oil pipelines. They've got economic income coming in. They've never wanted to be part of Iraq. They suffered under Saddam Hussein. They have their own military, and it's a military that's actually more successful than the Iraqi national military. This radicalized group called ISIS that's taking over Iraq right now, they ain't getting into Kurdistan because the Kurds have their own army who are keeping them out. So this ISIS group is beating the Iraqi national army, which is mostly Shia, and they're winning in the south. They're not winning in Kurdistan, which is why I'm saying watch out. The Kurds are getting ready to declare independence because they're going to say, well, the Iraq government can't handle this, but we can handle our own, and we're separate. Heard it here first. But who is this ISIS group that both the Iraqi government and the Kurds are fighting? This whole current calamity is driven by ISIS or ISIL. Now we can start to get to some names. ISIS stands for, an acronym for, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. There's an ISIS in there somewhere. However, you also might hear ISIL. ISIL. What's ISIL? Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. And that's crucial because the Islamic State of Iraq would imply that we, this radical group, are going to take over a state called Iraq and make it ours. ISIL is saying we're taking over an area called the Levant, the entire thing, and we're going to make that into an Islamic State. Okay, the Levant, what's that? That is all of Iraq, all of Syria, all of Lebanon, all of Jordan, all of Israel, and the Sinai Peninsula, and maybe even parts of Turkey and surrounding areas. This is classic Mesopotamia, the classic Fertile Crescent, the Levant. And these guys want to roll back the clock to the year 999, I guess, and create a super Arab Islamic state within all of this area. A super Islamic state that will be a training grounds and strategic center for terrorist attacks and mayhem across the region and planet Earth. This is why this is such a big, big thing that's happening right now. All right, so Who are the ISIS guys? It's an unrecognized state. No, in fact, no one on planet Earth will ever recognize it. North Korea's not even crazy enough to recognize this ISIS state. But this unrecognized state, it's comprised of active jihadist militant groups who are mostly of the Wahhabi movement. And the Wahhabis are a fringe radical group within Islam, a fringe sect that is what we'd call ultra-conservative, ultra-orthodox. Really, they truly want to turn back the hands of time, have all women sequestered inside, and beheadings and Islamic law is the state law, and whew, they're a tough bunch. And so you have folks who say, yes, this is what we want, and we want to get that state back. We want to turn back the time to 1,000 years ago when Arab power and the Arab Islamic State was at its height of power, the good old days, which is what ultra-Orthodox groups usually like to do, is bring back the good old days when we were in charge. Pretty fringe. 99% of Islamic folks I do not think would agree with any Wahhabist principles at all. I could be wrong, but I don't think so. Because the Wahhabist and this ISIS group in particular, they've killed more Muslims than anybody else, and they're going to kill way more. They have no room. Wahhabist movement thought, and this particular jihadist and the ISIS group, they have no room for any interpretation of Islam except their own. So they're more than willing to kill everyone. They'll kill every Islamic person that doesn't agree with their theory. No room for liberal thought, no room for change. They want to kill all the Shias because they think that's not proper Islam. They want to kill any subsect, the Sufis included, anyone who doesn't think purely Sunni thought like them, they want to kill them all. So they're a way bigger threat to Islamic folks than anybody else right this second. So the point being, the average Islamic person don't agree with none of this stuff. Why would they agree with stuff with people who want to kill them? So this unrecognized state and this jihadist militant group influenced heavily by the Wahhabist movement probably has 10 to 15,000 fighters right now. Many of whom started in the Ba'athist movement, many of whom are rejects, I won't say rejects, people who used to be in power in Iraq, used to be in military or political power in Iraq, Sunnis, who now have gotten dissed by the Shia-led government, who have been unhappy from the start. So they're the folks, again, who were committing terrorist acts and blowing stuff up. And then this group started to gain steam because it wasn't just about Iraq. It was about building their state. And when the Arab Spring started and civil war started in Syria, this group was already Johnny on the scene. They had Iraqi fighters, some former Iraqi military, the Ba'athist folks, jihadists who were bored because there was no more fighting in Afghanistan, or they're just waiting it out in Afghanistan for the U.S. to leave there as well. So you have a group of battle-hardened folks and jihadists from around the world who have now congregated in Syria to help overthrow the Syrian government. Because even though the Syrian government is Islamic, they're not Islamic enough. The current president and leader in the government of Syria is what we call Alawite, and they're a subsect of Islam that's not on par with Wahhabist thought. So these radicals are like, we're going to kill all those Alawite people and overthrow the government of Syria anyway, and they've been fighting in western Syria for the last couple years and bleeding over the border into Iraq. And now they formed a critical mass in the last several years now. They fought the U.S., they fought against the Iraqi government, they fought against the U.S. maybe in Afghanistan, they fought against the Syrian government, and these folks are armed to the teeth. They're getting funding from rich-ass people in the Gulf who are also of Wahhabist thought. That would be millionaires in Saudi Arabia and UAE and maybe even Yemen. So they got money, they got guns, and now they're winning. And here's a map from the New York Times, I believe, on where this ISIS group has been gaining ground in the last few years, where they control major cities and swaths of territory in Syria and Iraq, and of course now they're expanding. That's what you're hearing about in the current events right now, is this group suddenly got energized in the last week and said, you know what, we've got enough men, we've got enough arms, the Iraqi government is weak, it's go time. Let's do this. Let's build our ISIS, what we're fighting for. Let's go ahead and overthrow Iraq, we can do this. And they've been doing it because of all of the reasons we've talked about, the unstable situation in Iraq, the Shia-led government, the Shia-led military, which is not as battle-hardened. It's stocked full of Shia folks because al-Malaki put them there. They're not as seasoned veterans as all the Ba'athist people they fired out of the military. So the current Iraqi Shia, mostly Shia military, has just been falling by the wayside as these radicals storm through western and now heading south in Iraq. This is a terrible calamity for the Iraqis, by the way. Yes, I'm suggesting it's a world issue because they are going to form an area. If they form a state, it's going to be a terrorist state, self-proclaimed terrorist state. When they took the town of Mosul, the second biggest city in Iraq, and several other cities on their way to Baghdad in the last 72 hours, they've robbed every bank. They were already making money off of a drug trade, probably sexual slave trade, any illicit economic activity these guys have been doing, kidnapping, extortion. Western governments have paid these groups millions already in extortion for kidnapped people. And now they've robbed so many banks that I think the one they just robbed a couple days ago had $100 million in it. Something outrageous. So what you're looking at is a group of warriors who now have perhaps $500 million to $1 billion. And they're angry. And they want to take back or revert back to some ancient Islamic state. And they're winning. Could it get worse? Yeah, probably could. Because, as I've suggested, because of the destabilization of the entire state, I think the next move is Kurdistan declaring independence. And Kurdistan will likely work out some sort of deal and say, hey, look, ISIS, you do whatever you want. You recognize our border, we'll recognize yours. And for political legitimacy, ISIS is likely to say, yeah, sure, we'll recognize you. Good. We're not fighting off on the Kurds front anymore. We're not going to take over the Kurds yet, but we'll let them pretend like they've got a sovereign state until we get powerful enough to go kill them too. The Kurds' point of view is going to be like, yeah, we're going to declare independence because we can, because Iraq's government can't stop us at this point, and we can defend our territory. One of the general rules of sovereignty, if you can defend your territory, you're probably sovereign. And the Kurds can, and they are. So they're in every position to declare independence, and that will strike the death blow to the modern state of Iraq. Does that make sense? So, sorry, I know I've touched upon lots of different things here, but let me end with, where did this whole concept come from of a Iraq to begin with? And is there anyone else we can blame? And the answer is, sure we can. And in this case, we can also blame the British and the French. What? How can we get to the... What? Yep. This state of Iraq that we recognize in today's world is actually a product of the British and the French after World War I. Yeah, 100 years ago. The repercussions of 100 years ago are still being felt right this second. How so? Well, because 100 years ago, this whole area that we're talking about used to be controlled by the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Turk Empire, the remnants of which are the Turks in the state of Turkey today. But they controlled all of this area, the greater Middle East. Unfortunately for them, they sided up with the Germans in World War I, usually a bad move. Sorry, Germany. And because they lost World War I, the Allied powers, who were victorious, decided to carve up the Ottoman Empire. And in a secret agreement in 1916, before the war was even over, they knew the Ottomans were on the ropes and weren't going to last. And a secret agreement between the British and the French, and this is called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, or the Sykes-Picot Lines, you might even hear. The British ambassador and the French, or a French diplomat and a British diplomat, one named Sykes, one named Picot, thus the name, they got together secretly, actually with the Russians as well, and said, here's the deal, okay, we've kind of promised all these Arab people that they were going to get independence. And they believed us. here's what's going to happen. We're going to take this area for ourselves. So let's draw the lines of who gets what. And so we'll draw this line, and Britain, you get Iraq and Jordan, and Frenchies, you take Syria and Lebanon. And so the Sykes-Picot Agreement drew these Sykes-Picot lines. I just wish that I could find a document for you so I could show you what the original Sykes-Picot lines looked like. Oh, wait a minute. There it is. What? A secret agreement 100 years ago between European powers drew the modern lines of the Middle East. And by the way, the only reason we know about this is because the Russians were in on this, because they wanted the Ottoman territories up near the Black Sea, and so they were in on this action as well. However, they had the 1917 Communist Revolution, and when the communists took over the government of Russia and found these documents and the secret agreement, they made it public and embarrassed the hell out of everybody. They said, look all you Arab chumps. Here's your European buddies. They totally screwed you. So the Sykes-Picot Agreement drew the lines of the modern Middle East, and they did not, and I know I'm way over time, so I'm going to try to go faster. They did not consider any of the locals here. They didn't consider any historic lines. They didn't consider tribal affiliations. They didn't consider religious groups. They said, draw a line. That's now British territory. Let's call it Iraq. Oh, cool. Here's Jordan over here. So this is where it starts. In fact, there's a great book called A Peace to End All Peace, that a British historian wrote, suggesting that the lines drawn after World War I, the peace lines drawn after World War I, ensured that there would never be peace in the Middle East. He was pretty on the mark. A peace to end all peace. Look that one up. And that's what he's referring to. And it's coming to fruition 100 years later. Side note to you world regioners, this same process happened throughout the entire continent of Africa. All of Africa's current sovereign state lines were drawn by European powers 100 or more years ago, grouping together different affiliations and different tribes and different religious groups with no concern of what those folks wanted, who got along with who, or what a logical line should be. And now you're back to this place. Huh. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. Why would I bring up this historical note in an already overly long podcast? Well, just this. Because if you follow history at all, these things make way more sense, and it's way easier to predict what's going to happen. And the ISIS group, last Thursday, was it? Used the Sykes-Picot Agreement as a rallying cry and have made public statements saying, we, ISIS, are undoing the European imperialism of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. There is no Iraq. The British invented that crap. We are redrawing the lines of the Middle East as they should be, in our minds anyway. And again, I'm not defending ISIS. They're nuts. And they're going to kill millions of Islamic people if they're allowed to. And they're going to enact terror across the Western world if they're allowed to. But in their mind, they're saying that we are redrawing the proper lines for the Middle East, as they should be historically. And what we were promised after World War I, for God's sakes. The British and French lied to it. They got a point. They're nuts, but they're using that 100-year-old document as proof in the pudding of they're doing the right thing. Isn't it great when you understand history and you can see this stuff coming? Couple that radical thought, radical Wahhabist anti-Sykes-Picot thought, with the destabilization of Iraq, which was inherent in making it into a democracy with three competing groups and not doing enough to invest in that democracy long term to force these people to stay together. You know what? That's a hypothetical. Maybe if the U.S. had stayed in Iraq 100 years, these groups would still hate each other. But we'll never know because they hate each other now and the state is going to crash and burn. Got it? Get it? Good. Ask me any questions you have. I know this is very complicated. I've already talked more about it than I was going to. But I did want you to know, ISIS, ISIL, what the Levant is, what Sykes-Picot is, who the Sunnis versus Shias versus Kurds are just in Iraq, All of these are critical pieces and fairly simplistic pieces, I think, as I've outlined them, to understanding what's going on and why this group would be gaining so much steam and possibly redrawing the lines of the Middle East that will have global impact. And it will also impact surrounding countries and players who are going to get involved here very soon. And that's what I'll talk about next podcast. Party on.